Good evening, everyone. First off, I hope everybody can hear us and see us. If you can't, just let us know and we'll try to make adjustments as we go along. But I'd just like to welcome everyone to the next edition of our guest speaker series. This is our second one that we've done in our virtual format, so I apologize if we run into any technical difficulties or anything like that. We will work very hard that that doesn't happen, and if it does, we'll try to fix them as quickly as possible. But I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. This month's presenter is Eric Weatherbee, or better known as the Humble Bard. And he'll be sharing with us some of his short stories and poems that he's been writing and accumulating over time. And I really hope you guys enjoy it. And I just want to welcome Eric Weatherbee.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. Hello, everyone. Again, I'm Eric Weatherbee, also known as the Humble Bard. I want to thank Ryan Duffy from the Holland Land Office for inviting us to do this presentation tonight. It's always a pleasure to work with them. And I just wanted to mention a couple of things real quick. One reason I'm called the Humble Bard, or call myself the Humble Bard, I guess, is that my wife Betty and I and our daughter Megan, we put together a monthly magazine full of short stories and poems. And it's called the Humble Bard. So we have about 600 monthly readers, and they're all short stories and poems that I've written, and we basically do it for entertainment. Well, ours and yours, hopefully. So tonight, the theme tonight is actually a portrait of America through poetry. So I've just selected a few short stories and poems that I've written that depict certain areas of our country's history, and possibly some other individuals that have played important roles in that. So first of all, again, I want to thank Ryan Duffy from the Holland Land Office for inviting us. And also I want to thank my wife Betty and my daughter Megan for helping me do the magazine. They do all the bulwark. I simply write the stories, they do all the typing, formatting. It's currently about 30,000 pages a month, so they carry the load. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank them, tell them how much I love them, and glad they can put up with me. So tonight, to start with, the first poem I'm going to read. I'm very interested in the early 1800s, in particular the era of the riverboat gamblers. There's not a lot of recorded history about these folks. It was a pretty rough trade, actually. So a little bit that I did find out, what I did basically, this story is what I call a composite story. I took information from the little bits that were available from several different riverboat gamblers and combined them together, created my own character to try to display the type of lifestyle that went on at that time. Most of these folks didn't accumulate great fortunes. The few that didn't hang on to them, but there were a couple. One in particular was an individual by the name of George Duval. And he was probably king of the riverboat gamblers. And in 1886, he wrote an autobiography called 40 Years a Gambler on the Mississippi. And so I use him a lot as kind of a guidepost because not only was he a very successful gambler, he was also a very shrewd businessman. And so this story is a combination of several different characters, but it kind of follows, a lot of it follows his life story. And so without any further ado, I'd like to present my story, Whiskey, Guns, and Cards. The life of a gambler is never easy. The hand must always be quicker than the eye. For those that fail to heed this rule, playing cards is the surest way to die. He had his first taste of whiskey when he was just a young lad of 14. He was a stowaway on an old paddle wheeler and thus began his life aboard the Delta Queen. His early years had been pretty rough. He was orphaned as just a young child. He grew up in an orphanage where he was often punished for being disobedient and wild. But he was extremely bright and skillful, and he noticed where the old matrons had hid their gold. So late one night, he left that home for good, along with 50 coins of pure gold. He lived by his wits and never displayed the gold he had stolen that night. He did odd jobs for food and shelter, and from the law, he stayed out of sight. By the time he turned 13, he was tall and broad, one might say big for his young age. He had worked his way down through the Carolinas and now was a hostler for a local stage. He kept moving along from town to town, never staying long enough to put down roots. About the time he'd start to feel comfortable, he'd put on his traveling boots. He came into the small town of Madison, not far from the Natchez Trace. There he apprenticed with a gunsmith in town and slept in a stable for horses that race. He possessed an unusual dexterity with his hands that aided his education well. How this ability would affect his later years, only time would tell. He had a natural affinity with weapons, both rifle and pistols too. He often competed at local shooting contests. Crowds. Wiley Will Skellen was a three-card Monte game. Ran a three-card Monte game. It required both finesse and charm. The marks all thought he would be easy pickings because of the absence of his right arm. But old Will could shuffle and deal those cards, his one hand faster than any man's eye. And the money he reined in from those gullible marks caused many a grown man to break right down and cry. The young lad learned all the tricks of the trade, and soon he was a master of his craft. Old Wiley Will Skellen said, "There's one more thing that you must learn," and with that he began to laugh. Will said, "Whiskey is certainly a fool's best friend, and you can use it as a tool. It can loosen the purse strings of the most tight-fisted man and separate the money from its fool." Will said, "Always drink from your own stock, which is sarsaparilla in disguise. Be generous when buying drinks for the table. Consider it an investment for the wise." He said, "Control the cards, control the liquor, and with your firearm be able. These three things are what you'll need to be successful at the table." He said, "Be courteous and polite to the marks, and to their ladies give your best regards. Remember, the best things in life here on Old Man River come from whiskey, guns, and cards." The young lad worked with Will a short while longer, then each went his separate way. From Will he'd learned a lucrative trade, one he practiced unto this very day. The young lad plied his craft on riverboats from St. Louis to New Orleans. By the time he was 21, he was a man of considerable means. He met people from all walks of life, from planters to bankers and politicians too. The Mississippi River was the nation's highway, and from it, empires grew. He met kings and queens from Europe, Mark Twain, and other traveling bards. It was an interesting life on Old Man River, a life of whiskey, guns, and cards. By the age of 40, he had amassed a fortune in both cash and real estate. Many a plantation owner lost their fortunes and their land when they let the cards determine their fate. He worked at great riverboat steamers such as the Natchez, the Dubuque, and the Robert E. Lee. Poker was usually the game of the day, but the real moneymaker was three-card Monte. Three-card Monte was a game of chance. All set? Okay. Yep. He met kings and queens from Europe, Mark Twain, and other traveling bards. It was an interesting life on Old Man River, a life of whiskey, guns, and cards. By the age of 40, he had amassed a fortune in both cash and real estate. Many a plantation owner lost their fortunes and their land when they let the cards determine their fate. He worked at great riverboat steamers such as the Natchez, the Dubuque, and the Robert E. Lee. Poker was usually the game of the day, but the real moneymaker was three-card Monte. Three-card Monte was a game of chance that required both subtlety and sleight of hand. Fortunes were often lost in minutes, but it was a game in great demand. A riverboat gambler's life was a lonely one. He made enemies, but very few friends. And often the loss of a man's hard-earned fortune would result in a violent end. From Memphis to Vicksburg to Natchez and Baton Rouge, he was known to be a man both quick and able. With his black powder derringer, he had dispatched five poor losers over the range of a poker table. He was a cheat and a scoundrel, as most gamblers are, but from the law they were seldom sought. After all, it was only considered cheating if you were unfortunate enough to get caught. The young lad was no longer young, and years ago he'd acquired the name of Michael O'Gene. History would call him king of the riverboat gamblers. He'd come a long way since those first days aboard the Delta Queen. By the end of the Civil War, O'Gene was 50 years old. Most of his contemporaries had moved on west to relieve the cattlemen and miners of their gold. But Eugene continued to work the river. It was the only home he'd ever known. And through his skills and wise investments, his fortunes continued to grow. He had invested in Smith & Wesson. He owned distilleries in Tennessee. He'd owned a stable of thoroughbreds in Kentucky and a playing card company in Cincinnati. In 1895, he was 80 years old, and he'd become a legend in his own time. He was often interviewed by newspapers and magazines and was the subject of novels sold for a dime. In 1900, at the age of 85, Eugene was interviewed by the New York Times. They asked him to what he owed his monumental success. He pondered the question for a short time. He said, "The life of a gambler is never easy. It can be most difficult in many regards. But for my money, I'd bet my last dollar on whiskey, guns, and cards." There's a little side story to this story also. You heard me mention a character here by the name of Wiley Will Skellen. Well, Wiley Will Skellen was probably the best card sharp I had ever met. He was also my father-in-law. My wife's Betty's parents, Marge and Will Skellen, they played cards constantly. Euchre, Crazy Eights, there's a million games that they played, and I never met two people that played cards better than they did. On a few occasions, I won a rummy game from Will Skellen. It's because he let me win. I'm sure of that. Will passed away in 2013. He was a great guy, and we miss him. Betty's mom, Marge, at almost 90 years of age, she's still a card sharp, and I wouldn't bet anything against her. The next period of history that has really interested me, there's many periods of history that interest me, but is the Civil War era. I've often wondered about the families of combatants during the Civil War on both sides and how they were affected by the war. And a few years ago, several years ago, we made a trip to the Antietam battlefield. I was very impressed by a picture of that I had seen on a magazine of a two picket fence with a very narrow road running between them. And this was one of the most horrendous sights at that particular battle. So in 2004, we took a trip down there and toured the battlefield, and it was quite an amazing trip. So I guess the foundation for this story started way back then. I actually didn't write the story until 14 years later. I'd like to show you this picture here of the character of this story. In the story, I call this gentleman Captain Elijah P. Clemson. And there's quite a story behind this story. When I finish reading this, I'll relate that to you also. So this story is entitled The Portrait. My last name is Courtwright. Of course, that comes from my father's side. My mother's maiden name is Clemson, and in Tennessee, that name is known far and wide. As a boy, I visited Grandma Clemson as often as I could. I loved that old country home and its library paneled with oak wood. Inside that room full of books, it seemed that time had stood still, and on the west wall hung the portrait, and it remains there still. The portrait was of Captain Elijah P. Clemson, and beside it hung a portrait of his wife, Adelaide. Their life together spanned more than 60 years, and of such unions, legends are made. Captain Clemson was my grandmother's grandfather, and his wife Adelaide was her grandmother. For more than 6 decades, they lived on this small hillside farm, and neither had eyes for another. Grandma Clemson would read to me in that library from the time I was just a small boy. Her velveteen voice with its soft southern drawl was a pleasure to hear, and the stories she read gave me great joy. There was Moby Dick and Huckleberry Finn and the Last of the Mohicans, just to name a few. And with her lilting voice within that magical room, this young boy's imagination flew. And as she read to me, my mind would wander to distant lands, across the vast and ageless seas. And as my sight fell across the portrait, I sensed the captain watching over me. Grandma Clemson often told of the captain. She was just a young girl when he lived in this charming and peaceful place. She remembered him as a kind and gentle man, blessed with intelligence and grace. She said he had lost the sight of his left eye at the Battle of Shiloh on April 7th of 1862. But as a captain in the 1st Tennessee Volunteers, he led his men on throughout the great conflict between the gray and the blue. He had fought at Manassas, Antietam, Fort Donelson, and Gettysburg. He bore the physical and emotional scars that war inflicts on those caught up in its fray. He led his men gallantly through the battles of Stones River and the Wilderness, and then on to Kennesaw Mountain and the Battle of Mobile Bay. I was fascinated by the stories Grandma told of the captain, her grandfather, and the role he played in the war. And as she recited them to me, I would gaze at the portrait, and it seemed as if the captain stared back at me and longed to tell me more. I asked Grandma Clemson how she knew so much about the captain, as she was still a young girl when her grandfather passed away. She said her grandmother Adelaide bequeathed to her the captain's journal, and she had kept it to this very day. Grandma said Elijah returned to his family and this farm after the war and built this house with nothing but his own 2 hands. He built barns for cattle and cultivated crops, and almost a century later, the grand old house still stands. As the years wore on and I became a young man, I walked to Grandma's house each day. It was only about 2 miles from my parents' house in town, and I enjoyed the scenery along the way. Quite often I would stay overnight on Friday, as on Saturday school was not in session. And after Grandma had gone to bed, I would remain in the library, staring at the portrait. With me, it had become an obsession. The portrait had been done just after the war by a local artist known as Jeremiah Place. His talents had captured the captain's prominent features and added a lifelike quality to the portrait's unique face. In the portrait, the artist portrayed the minute scars and worry lines of a life lived long and well. And in its eyes, yes, its eyes burned an intensity of torment from one who had witnessed more than just a glimpse of hell. As I gazed upon the portrait of the captain, his eyes seemed to bore into my very soul, and I began to wonder about all he had seen and done, and how the war had affected him. How heavy was its ultimate toll? One day as I entered Grandma's house, it was just 1 week before my high school graduation. Grandma called out to me from her bedroom door and said, "Robert, I'll be just a few minutes longer in my preparation." I was startled when she called me Robert, for she seldom called me by my given name, and as she shuffled through the library door, she held something tightly in her hands, and she surely did not look the same. I asked her, "Grandma, are you all right?" as I guided her to her favorite chair. She responded with, "I'm right as rain, child, just a bit old and a bit slow, so please do not have a care." She said, "I have something for you, Robert. It's a graduation gift, though a bit early, I suppose, but I thought we could share some of it together. It will be our secret for now, at least that is what I propose." And with that, she brought forth the manuscript that she held so lovingly in her aged and weary hands. And between its soft brown leather covers lie the story of Elijah Philip Clemson, the captain, and more importantly, the man. She said only a handful of people have ever read this journal, and those that have claimed their lives were changed forever. It is a lengthy book with a revealing look at one man's lifelong endeavor. And so each night we read a few entries within that manuscript, and oh, the treasures there together we did find. And as the portrait gazed down silently upon us, I sensed the presence of an intriguing and remarkable mind. My high school graduation took place the next Saturday, and with my parents' help, Grandma participated in this most prestigious affair. She smiled, clapped her hands, and cheered me on when I tossed my mortarboard into the springtime air. I had taken a summertime job as a cashier at Mr. Wiley's Five and Dime. I was unsure about my further education, but I was young and had plenty of time. 3 days after graduation, I went to Grandma's house, directly from work, as was my daily routine. But as I knocked and entered her front door, I felt something different in the air, as my instincts were exceptionally keen. I called out to her as I went room to room, but only a deafening silence returned to my worried ears. And as I entered the library, I saw her there, sitting in her favorite chair, and my eyes filled up with tears. She appeared to be resting peacefully. A look of serenity encompassed her face. And as I sat there beside her and wept openly, the portrait viewed us solemnly as it hung from its honored place. In her hand, she held the journal, the place we left off marked there by a letter. It was addressed To my grandson Robert, and to read it, I moved where the light was better. The letter stated, Robert, you are my only grandson, a most precious gift from my only daughter. Our time together has been an ocean of delight, and you are the ocean's water. Please do not feel sad for me, for now I enter a garden of light. And when the weight of the world seems too much to bear, think of our time together, and your days will become sunny and bright. At present, you are the last of the Clemson line, but someday I am sure you will find a loving spouse. So to you I bequeath my entire estate, this farm, its land, and this house. So fill up this house with love and laughter, and manage this estate as you see fit. Finish reading the captain's journal, but be wary of the power of the portrait. A few days after Grandma's services, with my parents' help, I moved into that lovely old home. My days I spent grooming the grounds outside, and by night within the library, I let my imagination roam. Grandma's estate had left me well off, and I vowed to rejuvenate this century-old farm. I envisioned meadows filled with plump grazing cows and fields of grain blessed by the sun's golden charm. Day by day, I could see progress being made, and as I worked with my hands, I felt the sweat of my brow. I worked with my mind as I laid out the design of my fields and then sculpted them with harrow and plow. I worked from sunup to sundown and sometimes into the dark of the night. My parents worried that I had become obsessed with this place. I said, don't worry, but in truth, they were right. Each night I read from the captain's journal, and though weary, his story captivated me long past the time I should have gone to bed. But the true story he told was just beginning to unfold, and when I slept, I envisioned it all in my head. One rainy afternoon, I decided to retire early, as it had become too wet to work in the fields. So I showered, made myself an early supper, and then retired to the library to see what adventures the captain's journal would yield. I was at the part of the journal where Elijah Clemson had joined the 1st Tennessee Volunteers. He picked up his rifle and set out on foot. The war had commenced, and he felt duty-bound as he left his wife and 3 daughters, all filled with anxiety and fears. In his mind, Elijah thought this trouble would soon end, and shortly he would be back with his family at their farm. Little did he know how long he would be gone when he became one of the thousands of men at arms. Elijah was intelligent and quick and had a natural affinity with weapons. His abilities were soon recognized by his Confederate superiors of the day. He rose quickly through the ranks, and shortly before the Battle of Shiloh, the insignia of captain was impressed upon his uniform of gray. The captain led his men with confidence and compassion. Their admiration for him grew greater day by day. But late at night, by the fading campfire light, Elijah grieved silently for each man lost amidst the battle's fray. The captain lost the sight of his left eye at the Battle of Shiloh when a musket barrel exploded in his face. And though wounded and blinded in one eye, he would let no other man take his place. The hour was growing late as I read these entries in this amazing journal of a relative I had never known. But as I consumed each page of this account from another age, my admiration and respect for him had monumentally grown. From time to time, I would glance up at the portrait. It seemed as though the captain was urging me on to read more. It was as if his eyes were pleading for me to continue reading his description of the savagery of this terrible war. As I read further, the captain's account of the war grew more detailed. It became so graphic, I felt as if I were there. My mind's eye could see the wounded and dying, and the smell of black powder seemed to permeate the library air. Again, I glanced up at the portrait, but this time its eyes beckoned me to come near. And as I gazed into that sightless left eye, I could hear the battle cry, and my heart became frozen with fear. I was mesmerized as I stood staring into the captain's sightless left eye. I could hear cannon fire, the clash of sabers, and the sounds of horses screaming in terror. I took one step toward the portrait, and until this day, I'll not forget the result of that simple error. The winds of war filled that library completely. The left eye of the portrait had become a void as large as the door. And though I fought fervently to remain, my efforts were in vain, as I was pulled through the left eye of the portrait into the horrors of that ghastly war. I hit the ground with incredible force. The wind was driven from my very chest as I fell. And as I gasped for air, my soul filled with despair, for as I stood, I knew I had arrived in a garden of hell. I was dressed in a uniform of gray. On the ground lay a musket at my feet. And as I looked around, I heard the horrifying sound of men dying as they attempted to retreat. I heard the sounds of mortars as they whistled through the air. I felt the whiz of minie balls as they whipped past my head. I did not know whether to run hither or fro, and I was surrounded by scores of the wounded, the dying, and the dead. And suddenly I was again knocked to my knees as a lead bullet tore a piece from my right ear. I was shocked to see my own blood on my hands, and I could not manage to stand as my body became petrified with fear. And as I again attempted to rise, a shadow loomed large above me. I looked up into the eyes of a soldier clad in blue, and as he raised his bayonet, I witnessed not 1 ounce of remorse or regret as he prepared to run me through. And then his face disintegrated as a pistol round found its mark, and before his body hit the ground, I knew he was dead. My savior was an officer of some rank who fired his pistol point blank and struck my would-be executioner in the head. He was dressed in a uniform of gray, though tattered and worn. I knew he was an officer by the sidearm he had used. His face was a map of scars and small lines. It had somehow been maligned, for the left side was battered and bruised. He said, "Come along now, son, we must hurry out of here. If we linger, we will both surely die." He seemed somehow familiar, his face somewhat similar, and then I noticed the damaged left eye. As he raced out of that meadow, I gasped, "Where are we? What day is this?" The officer pulled me along, almost dragging me off my feet. He asked, "You do not know where you are? You have surely come far, and we are both here at this place called Antietam Creek." He said, "You must be in a bad way. Do you not remember the date? I'll help you, but first we must get past this regiment of blue. We must get through that cornfield and into the Dunkard Church on the 17th day of September of 1862. I could not believe what I had just heard. Somehow, in some way, I was at Antietam Creek on September 17th, 1862, and yet the horrors that I saw, the human wreckage, ragged and raw, convinced me that all of this was undeniably true. And so I followed that officer into that wretched field, where we fought like tigers in a jungle of corn. The crop fell just mown down by a grape sigh, lead rained down from the sky, and the gates of hell were wide open, I could have sworn. I followed that man to that blood-soaked, ravaged land, and I was in awe of his skills in this hideous theater of death. With a Walker Colt 44 in his right hand and a saber in his left, he carved a path by taking his enemy's very life breath. I too fired my rifle, and I took other men's lives as we fought our way against this tidal wave of blue. My actions left me howled and sickened. My heart raced, my pulse quickened. I'd become a killer, but what else could I do? We had not reached the Dunkard Church yet. I used my rifle and bayonet. The officer fired his pistol round after round as we fled. There were scores of men falling and crying, bleeding and dying, and this music of hell filled my head. And suddenly I felt my body pitch as we ran headlong into a deep ditch, and there we took a moment's respite. The officer asked me, "How are you, lad? That right ear is looking bad." I could not answer, for I was appalled by this ghastly sight. There were bodies with their limbs all askew, dressed in uniforms of both gray and blue, in places 3 or 4 deep where they fell. My eyes burned with black powder, the cannon fire grew louder, and death was the only scent I could smell. We moved a few yards farther within that ravine, attempting to keep our movements mostly unseen, and we came to rest near the body of a young soldier in blue. I thought surely he was dead, but then I saw him suddenly move his head, and as he reached for the rifle and the officer, he saw the movement too. The officer reacted quickly and snatched the rifle from that dying young Union soldier's hand. He said to the soldier, "Son, there's no use in lying. You know you are dying, but we will stay with you and comfort you the best that we can." With that, he lifted the soldier's head and gave him a drink from his own canteen. And I thought, this officer in gray, whom I've just met here this day, I had never guessed he with the blind eye and scarred face. I had never seen such an act of compassion from a man so bold in action. He must be truly an angel of grace. The young soldier said his name was Percy. He thanked the officer for his mercy, and the officer said this in reply: though we be men at arms on different sides of this conflict, we both spill our life's blood on this Maryland sod. Whether we die or we mend, remain enemies or become friends, we are still all children of God. With that, the young soldier took his last breath. He appeared peaceful in death, and I wept for all the souls lost in this war. I looked into the officer's mournful eyes, and with a great shock I realized where I had seen that battle-scarred face before. In that ditch dark and dank, I asked the officer his rank, my mind still besieged with all kinds of fears. He replied, it just so happens that I am a captain in a company of the 1st Tennessee Volunteers. The fact of the matter was plain. I thought I must be going insane, and if so, I might as well get the job done. So I asked, Captain, what is your name? And when the reply came, he said, my name is Elijah Philip Clemson. I was amazed and astounded, for my fears were now grounded in this madness that I could not fathom yet. But I could not deny that this captain, blind in his left eye, was one and the same with the portrait. The captain seemed to notice my mental state, but that we must move or meet our fate here in this ravine of the damned. So we crawled up the far bank amongst a fusillade of lead to reach the Dunkard Church with our immediate goal. We raced to that field of corn, our bodies both ragged and worn, and as we ran, we tread upon the remains of those that had paid the ultimate toll. We saw a rail fence near the end of the rows, but when we reached it, we froze, for the macabre sight there took our breaths away. The sunken road between the rails of this fence was littered with the bodies of soldiers dispensed, while others hung like puppets from the rail fence's upright stays. And the fighting blazed on, almost muzzle to muzzle, across this narrow road. There was no way either side could possibly miss. We ran among the soldiers as they fell, and we too fought along this highway to hell, the road disappearing into a smoke-filled abyss. The captain said, son, you must attempt to cross or be forever lost. The Dunkard Church is but a quarter-mile away. He said, good luck to you, son, as he reloaded his guns. He said, my men are here, so it is here that I must stay. Tears filled my eyes as I said my goodbyes to this past relative of mine that more than once saved my life in this most incredible place. He held out his hand, and as I grasped it firm, and as I did so, he pulled me close so that we were face to face. He said, war is Satan's tool. He uses to turn God's children into fools. Remember what you witnessed here on this day. Live your life long and well. Be wary of the entrapments of hell, and take time to help your fellow man along life's path on your way. And in a moment he turned back into that cauldron where life and death churned, and I prayed I could become half the man that he was. And the lesson I learned was that respect was not given but earned, and a man should be judged only by the things that he does. So I ran straight across that sunken road, my conscience a heavy load. I wished only to leave this war-torn place of the past. But as I climbed that fence on the other side, my eyes opened wide, and I knew that I had breathed my last. For straight ahead of me, I stared into the bore of a rifle. The soldier that held it was clad in Union blue. When I looked into his eyes, it was then that I realized my days on this earth were through. I saw him pull the trigger. I saw the flash when the percussion cap ignited that black powder. And though the battle still raged around me, that rifle shot seemed even louder. I saw the bullet spiral out from that rifle's bore. I saw the battle surround me. I felt the impact astound me, and then I felt nothing more. I was lifted off of my feet and found myself flying backwards, tumbling back through this playground of hell. And then I struck something hard. My bones felt battered and jarred, but when I opened my eyes, I knew all was well. For I was back in the library, lying on the hard floor, shaken and distraught, but otherwise well, or so it seemed. I just could not believe how I had been deceived by my mind in this perilous dream. I got up from the floor and looked all around this old room and satisfied myself that I was both safe and secure. But the dream was so intense, I could still see that rail fence, and suddenly I felt cold and unsure. I looked up at the portrait, and though it still hung there yet, it had moved somewhat out of line. I reached out gently to straighten it. I felt great respect for it, for I knew I had met the captain, if only in my mind. I decided to take a hot shower at this early morning hour to help me recover from this dream so full of intensity and fear. The water fell like a soft, warm rain, but as I stepped in, I felt a sharp pain, and my hand came away bloody from a damaged right ear. It's been several years now since that most unusual night. I have a lovely wife who has given me two precious children. The farm is doing well, we live off the produce we sell, and life here is peaceful and unburdened. We work hard all through each day. The children romp and they play through the meadows and fields of the small Tennessee farm. And after dinner each night, it seems only proper and right to read to our children in that old library so full of history and charm. And then my wife takes the children upstairs to tuck them in bed, and I linger instead and say I'll be up in just a few minutes more. And I wait there patiently until I hear faintly the closing of each bedroom door. Then I proceed to the west wall of that room I keep so meticulously groomed. I salute the picture of a man whom physically I have never met. But as I look into the captain's eyes, I remember and realize the life lessons I've learned from the portrait. When I wrote this story, I had written the story specifically for a live presentation. The story was well liked. We published it in the Humble Bard magazine and countless other times. I've lost track. We probably reprinted it 500, maybe 1,000 times. And by that time, I had been looking for a picture to go with the story. I didn't have anything of my own. It was hard to find an actual portrait of Confederate officers at the time. There were very few pictures available. So a friend of ours advised us to check out the Library of Congress. So we did. Probably looked at 500 different pictures, and like all of my stories, I write by sensory perception. I was looking for the picture to just filled my mind that would be the character for this story. Well, when I came across the picture of this gentleman, I told Betty, I said, this is the guy. This is my character in the story, Elijah P. Clemson. In reality, though, this gentleman's real name is William H. Luse, L-U-S-E, and he was a lieutenant colonel in the 18th Mississippi Infantry. And the unusual part is we had already written the story, it had been published, we read it many times, many presentations. So I knew nothing about this gentleman until I purchased the picture, and then we started to look back through his history, as limited as it was. The portrait was actually taken in 1861, shortly after the Civil War began. And this Lieutenant Colonel William H. Luse from the 18th Mississippi Infantry, in the story, my character, Elijah Clemson, had placed at several battles throughout the Civil War. And in reality, as far as we could check back into his history, he had been at every one of those battles. It's a very unusual story about the story, and we intend to try to find more information about this gentleman and possibly see if he has any relatives in that area yet. It'd be quite a thing to find out more about him. For my next story, another phase of history that I've been very interested in, and possibly because I've known several people that have lived through this time, was the time of the Great Depression. And I've written several stories about that time, and this one in particular was actually, the story was actually based on a story that my grandfather told me. So I'd like to read the story to you, and then I will tell you a little bit more about it afterwards. This story was also published in our magazine and in our books. And so I'm going to read you the prologue that goes with the story from the book. The story is called A Rhodes Scholar, R-O-A-D''S. I've often been impressed by people's individual abilities. I've met people over the past 50 years that seem to be able to master any task that comes their way. Quite often these people have had little or no formal education, yet their abilities display an intelligence that can truly be called a gift. You're all familiar with the terms a Rhodes Scholar, R-H-O-D-E-S. Cecil Rhodes was a British colonial capitalist who, upon his death, left a large financial gift to Oxford University. Oxford University established a Rhodes Scholarship Program. These scholarships are awarded to students from around the world who display exceptional scholastic abilities and leadership attributes. A Rhodes Scholar, this story, R-O-A-D''S, is about a character whose education was quite different from most. The title is a play on words, and I think you'll agree that education comes in many forms. It was the middle of August of the year 1931. It was hot and dry. Field crops suffered under a relentless sun. We were loading hay. It was piled loose and high. The day was almost done, the sun setting in the sky. Evening at last was upon us as we pulled in our last load, with a soft, sweet-smelling hay along that hot and dusty road. I sat beside my grandpa in his 1927 Model A. A ride in this old truck was much more fun than loading hay. Money was very tight back then, and times were pretty lean. On the faces of the country folk, the stress was easily seen. We bartered for goods and services we could not afford to buy. When times got tough, we got tougher. Working hard together is how we all survived. Granddad said, "Don't worry, everything will work out fine." It had been just 2 years since the crash of '29. All my family worked together on that rocky hillside farm. It was not the most productive land, but to me it held a certain charm. We milked the cows and cut the hay and planted barley, corn, and oats. We fed the pigs and then the chickens, and then we fed the goats. It was almost more than we could do in a 20-hour day. We longed to have a hired hand, but there was no money with which to pay. And so it was on that summer's eve, when Granddad and I were hauling hay, we came upon a lone man walking, and he was heading just our way. Grandpa stopped and said to him, "What brings you out our way?" The man smiled and said, "For just one night, a peaceful place to stay." Granddad replied, "Help us out unload this hay, and you'll be sure to be well fed. Then we'll make for you in the barn a proper place to lay your head." The man said, "It's a deal, and my name is John," as he climbed into the truck. He said, I spent 5 days out in Elba working on the muck." He was slight and small of stature. His hair was turning gray. His looks were unimpressive, but man, could he mow hay. My grandparents and my folks, with my siblings and I, made 8. And at the table on that night, we set another plate. And as we sat and reached for the food and gazed upon this stranger's face, we all were rather humbled when he asked, "May I please say grace?" Granddad said we'd be honored, and we commenced to bow our heads. Silence filled that dining room, and this is what he said. He said, "Hello, dear Lord, it's John again, and I know you know who's talking. I just wanted to give you thanks for these fine folks I met while I was walking. You know I've traveled far and wide, and you've been with me all the while. So once again, I'll just say thanks for all your help through those countless miles. Well, dear Lord, it's getting late. My gosh, it's almost 10. So I'll give my thanks one more time, and please bless these fine folks. Amen." And with that, we commenced the evening meal. John did justice to it all. When he finished, John thanked us once again and said, "I'll just go bed down in the stall." When morning came at 4 a.m., we left the house to do the chores, and to our surprise, we met John at the cow barn doors. He said the cows were all milked and they are fed. I was heading to the old pig sty to feed the pigs and then the chickens before I said goodbye. It was the first time in my young life I saw Granddad at a loss of words to say, but then he said, "John's money's tight, but we could keep you right. We'd be honored if you could stay." John smiled and said, "The pay is fair, and I'll help you out for just a few more days. But I've got miles to go before it snows, so then I'll be on my way." So John helped us out to finish the hay and mend the pasture fence. Granddad said, "That man's a wizard with any tool, hammer, saw, or wrench." We were all in awe of John's intellect and the way he thought things out. Granddad said, "He must be an educated man from some university, no doubt." And as the evenings neared, we rushed through our chores and made for the kitchen table. For after grace and through the meal, John would talk of fact and fable. John told of the many places he'd been and of others he longed to go. He talked of great rivers and deserts and jungles and mountains topped with snow. John talked of ancient peoples, the Aztecs and Mayans, to name a few. He told of the pharaohs of Egypt and the Incas and some strange land called Peru. John retold the tales of great authors and poets, Shakespeare, Whitman, Emerson, and Thoreau. He frightened us with The Pit and the Pendulum by that weird guy, Edgar Allan Poe. He talked of distant galaxies and stars in this universe so wide. He told of the moon's effect on us and how it caused the tides. And when we finally went to sleep, our heads were filled with dreams of distant lands and galaxies, all within our reach, it seemed. I asked Granddad where John called home. He said that I do not know, but he certainly had great education. There's little he does not know. We worked hard and long each day beneath that blazing sun. John mastered each and every task and never stopped till they were done. And then came that day we all knew would come when John said he must go. He had many miles he had to travel before the winter's snow. So we declared a feast that night for John, our honored guest, in the hopes that he would remember us while on his endless quest. And after grace was said and the meal was consumed by all, John told us tales from around the world, some true and others that were quite tall. Then John thanked us for this lovely meal and for this peaceful place to rest. When Emily, the youngest of us all, said she had one more small request. John, she said, we know that you'll be leaving us and we will miss you, oh, so much. Could you please read to me that Greek legend about King Midas and his touch? John looked at her and said, oh, sweet girl, I'd love to read to you on this very special night, but the sad and sorry truth be known, I can neither read nor write. We all just stopped and stared at him. We could not believe what we had just heard. This wise and worldly gentleman could neither read nor write a word. John said, I hope I have not misled you by the things I've done or said. All these tales I've told to you, I've carried in my head. John said, there is one more tale I can tell this night before we go to sleep. It is a strange but truthful story. It may even make you weep. Granddad said, well, John, you surely have surprised us. We thought you must have been book learned, but our friendship and our deep respect you have truly earned. So please, John, do tell us all this story that is true, and we will listen with anxious ears and a great respect that is due to you. John said, I'll make this story short, for the night is getting old. The tale that I am about to tell is true, but it's one I've never told. John said, I never knew my parents. I was orphaned right at birth. No one knew who they were or if they are still upon this earth. I lived in an old orphanage in a Kansas town of Hayes. I stayed there until the age of 12, and then one night I ran away. I traveled around from town to town. I begged and borrowed to survive. I learned to fight and then to steal. That's how I stayed alive. I learned to watch and listen and to observe how things were done. And then I could do many jobs, and I did not have to run. I traveled all over this great land, west to east, north to south. I heard hundreds of tales and stories, all learned by word of mouth. And then in 1917, while working the docks of Baltimore, I decided that I would enlist and fight in the war to end all wars. So across that great sea I went, full of fight and none the wiser, to meet the beast on foreign land and fight the armies of the Kaiser. But when my feet hit those foreign shores, what I saw made my blood run cold. There was death and dying everywhere, and I prayed for my immortal soul. It was the first time I had ever asked the Lord for his holy hand. I begged, dear Lord, deliver me from this savage land. I thought it became disconnected. Okay, sorry about that. I'll back up a little bit. But when my feet hit those foreign shores, what I saw made my blood run cold. There was death and dying everywhere, and I prayed for my immortal soul. It was the first time I'd ever asked the Lord for his holy hand. I begged, dear Lord, deliver me from this savage land. And as the days grew into weeks, I took the lives of many men. And for each man I put asunder, I prayed, Please forgive me, Lord. Amen. Then came that day in 1918, in late September of that year, while in that Aragon forest, a German bullet almost took this life so dear. And as I lay recovering, the war came to an end. The Lord kept me from death's door and became my closest friend. He came to me in visions and appeared in all my dreams. He took away my cares and fears and healed my wounds, it seems. The Lord said, go from here and I will guide you like the point upon a knife. Learn all you can to help your fellow man within the school of life. So when my wounds were healed and I left that desolate land, I sailed upon the 7 seas and crossed the desert sands. Each day I sought to learn something new and open doors within my mind, so that I might impart some small bit of knowledge along the trail I left behind. The desire to learn to read and write in me is like a fire burning, but for the past 30 years or so, I've been just too busy learning. John said education comes in many forms, not just from books and haughty schools. Those that are impressed with their own knowledge, history proves them fools. When John had finished his tale of truth, there were tears in many eyes. He said, I'll see you all in the morning to say my last goodbyes. With that, he went out into the night to rest and prepare for the long journey ahead. The rest of us, emotionally drained, stumbled off to bed. And after the morning chores were done and the sun began to rise, John met us at the back porch steps to say his last goodbyes. There were hearty, heartfelt handshakes, some hugs and a tear or two. Then Granddad said, John, hold on a minute. We have a gift for you. Granddad went back inside the house and came back with an ancient book in tow. It was a family copy of Homer's Odyssey, that Greek poet of long ago. Granddad said, John, I know you cannot read this now, but I know that someday you will be able. And when you're reading, think of us and those pleasant nights around our kitchen table. John, this book is about a journey not unlike your own. It is a gift from all of us to you, John, the smartest man we've ever known. John took the book and thanked us all, and he shook my granddad's hand. He said, with any luck, I'll be back someday, and our time together will be grand. And as he walked down that long dirt road, he waved, and then to the wind turned up his collar. And Granddad turned and said to me, there goes an educated man from the school of life, and he is a true Rhodes Scholar. This story is actually based on a story that my grandfather had told me, and my father also, many years ago. My grandparents, they worked a lot of land on Route 31 west of Rockport. They grew a lot of tomatoes and other produce, but tomatoes mostly. And when it came time to pick tomatoes, they would go into Brockport, where there are 3 bridges, and there was 3 hobo camps there, and they would hire these folks to come out and help harvest the tomato crop. One year they hired this gentleman. He was very well spoken, seemed to be very well educated. And 3 years in a row, he came back and they hired him each time. And over time, they got to know him a little bit. And the last year that he was there, he had told my grandparents that prior to the crash of 29, he had maintained a very successful law practice in the city of Philadelphia. But he had many investments, and when the crash took place, he lost everything. And this was how he was making his living. So that's kind of where the basis of this story came from. Let's see here. The next poem I'd like to read, like I said, this theme of this is kind of a portrait of America. And there's probably nobody more familiar with America than the American trucker. I work with truck drivers on a daily basis from all over the country and out of the country, and I've driven truck myself a few times to help make ends meet. So I have a lot of respect for these folks and the things they've seen and the places they've met, people they've met rather, and I think they really see a portrait of this country that many of us probably never see. So I wrote this short poem, and it's called Going Home. I don't know where the years have gone. Time just seems to slip away. You work until the job is done, then it's become another day. It's been nearly 40 years now since I hooked on to my first load. I've traveled more than 3 million miles down this lonesome road. I've roamed across this great land of ours from sea to shining sea. I've looked at life through a windshield for what seems like eternity. So I think this will be my last run, and I will no longer roam. I'll return to that place from whence I came, that place that I call home. I remember as a child living on that hillside farm. We hunted and fished among those Blue Ridge hills. They were the Shenandoah's charm. I remember the people and the places I once knew there as a boy. Though most of them are gone now, their memories still bring me joy. And now I'm heading back there on this, my final run, to find my place among those purple hills beneath that warm Virginia sun. I left Bakersfield behind me with this, my final load. I'm back on US 40, heading east on that endless road. My destination is Richmond with this load of table wine. The truck's in shape, the logs up to date, and the weather should be fine. And as I travel down that highway, the memories flood my mind, like the time I outran a Kansas twister back in '89. And then there was that time in Montana when an Alberta clipper came howling through, left me stranded for 3 days up on Highway 2. Well, Albuquerque's behind me now, and I'm ahead of that foul weather warning. And just like that old George Strait song, I'll be in Amarillo by morning. I remember all the faces and some names of the folks I've met along the way. All in all, it's been a good life. I count my blessings every day. There was Rickshaw Ron in Chinatown that guided me through those gnarly streets. There was Bitterroot Bob in Idaho that led me through those mountainous peaks. Then one time in that Boston town, I met team drivers Bob and Lenore. They knew every back street and alley from Bar Harbor to Baltimore. Romances, yes, there were a few, although quite brief as I recall. But once I almost said I do out near Wichita Falls. From Barstow to Reno to Denver and Des Moines to Bismarck and Boise too. I met folks from all walks of life, from St. Petersburg to Kalamazoo. Well, I'm coming into Little Rock now, just before the morning light. Traffic's heavy and it's moving slow, so I think I'll pull off and grab a bite. And as I'm sitting there at that 76 stop, watching those big rigs come and go, I think when I retire, will I have to fight the urge to put it in gear and go? And as I pull out onto US 40, heading east toward my destination, I can't help but notice the countless trucks that traverse this great nation. I remember every truck I've owned, and there have been quite a few. There are Peterbilts and Kenworths and Freightliners, one or two. These trucks were the tools I used to make a life out on the road. It became part of my very soul as they pulled those countless loads. Well, I'm an hour east of Memphis now, and traffic is moving fine. One more day, and I'll be in Richmond and deliver this load of wine. And as I'm rolling down this highway with the sunshine warm upon my face, I feel a deep contentment brought upon me by the rhythm and the pace. As I think about the life I've led over these past almost 40 years, I wonder, can I leave it all behind as I move up through the gears? I find my soul is troubled as I contemplate this new life I'll soon begin. Can I really walk away from all I know and the places that I've been? Nashville is just behind me now, and I'll reach Knoxville with a setting sun, and there I'll start heading north on US 81. The evening is now upon me, and Knoxville is out of sight. The moon is full, and the stars are out, so I'll just roll on through the night. The logbook says I'm out of hours now, so I'll pull off and take a rest. It occurs to me that this thing that I've been doing is the thing that I do best. I'm rested and I'm ready now to continue on my way. I'll reach Richmond and deliver this load before the end of day. The road is calling to me, just like the siren song. I'll never find the home I'm searching for, because I've been there all along. So I'll just make a few phone calls and find myself another load, and then I'll head back to the home I love, out there on the road. Like I said, I work every day with truck drivers. I have great respect for these people. To most of them anyways, it's not just a job or an occupation, it's a way of life. And so I dedicate that story to all the truckers I know. One of the, I guess most, I don't want to say the greatest, but one of the most noted structures in America, I guess would be true Americana, is the American outhouse. So I A while back, I wrote this short poem, and it's a rather humorous one known as The Outhouse Astronaut. Many, many years ago, when I was just a lad, my parents tried to impress upon me that in regards to your health, smoking was truly very bad. But I was young and knew everything, and so I simply paid no heed. Little did I know the other dangers that were associated with this unhealthy deed. Now, my granddad was a kindly man, and he loved tractors, cows, and cars. But the one vice he allowed himself was the occasional cigar. One evening while I was playing inside his old half-done Chevy pickup, I saw him sneak out back behind the old barn with a cigar, and I watched him light her up. The aroma of that old stogie filled my senses to the brim, so I decided that if I too smoked like Granddad, I would be just like him. So several times over the next few months, I snitched a cigar from Granddad's private stash. Around the farm, I found several hidden places to puff away, careful to leave no evidence of my crime, not even a flake of ash. But Granddad became suspicious as his stash was running low, and he often looked at me suspiciously, and I thought, I wonder if he knows. And thus I sought a hidden place where there was no danger of getting caught, and that is how I became the world's first and only outhouse astronaut. You see, I thought the family privy would be the perfect place to hide my crimes. Oh, wasn't I a genius, was the thought that crossed my mind. So each night after supper, I would bide my time so as not to arouse suspicion by going out too soon. And then I would head out to my private smoking lounge, the one adorned with a crescent moon. And there inside the confines of the family privy, I would enjoy my secret pleasure. And despite its natural fragrance, I thought this place is a treasure. But then one night my plans went awry as Mother Nature played her role, and payback for my evil doings took a very hefty toll. You see, it had been raining off and on for 2 days, and that old outhouse wood was surely swelling up. And as I entered my personal smoking parlor, I had to pull extra hard to make that outhouse door completely shut. I lit the candle that I routinely brought with me, as it was pretty dark inside my secret hideaway, but the burning candle toppled from its holder into the storage tank below and lit that outhouse up like a Roman holiday. Flames belched up from that single hole and set the Sears robot catalog on fire. Not only did I lose our favorite source of toilet paper, but the flames engulfed my favorite picture of Miss May, 1954, the object of my heart's desire. That old outhouse really started to rock and roll as I tried in vain to open that wooden door without any type of tool. And then from down below came a thunderous roar as a methane gas turned into rocket fuel. Well, that old outhouse went straight up with a horrendous wrenching sound, and there it hovered like a great bird of prey about 3 feet off the ground. And then suddenly it shot sideways out towards the pasture lot. That wooden door somehow blew open, and there I sat in the cockpit, an unwilling outhouse astronaut. That outhouse rocket blasted through the pasture fence where our milk cow Bessie was grazing in the evening breeze. Her eyes grew as large as cantaloupes as I shot by, and I'm sure her milk had turned to cheddar cheese. I rocketed through the meadow and then into the pasture where Grandfather kept a team of mules. The farm had converted to John Deere tractors, but Granddad still had a few mule-drawn farming tools. Now, Cletus was Granddad's favorite mule, and he stood about 12 hands tall. He wore a leather harness that Granddad used to lead him to and from his stall. A single board had worked loose from that flying outhouse and was twirling round and round, and as I sped by Cletus, it caught hold of his harness and started pulling him across the ground. From my position in the cockpit, I could see Cletus racing through that pasture grass, and as I looked out, there was no doubt I was truly hauling ass. Well, that board broke off and Cletus came to a halt, thankful, I'm sure, to end this awful plight. But suddenly losing my only connection with the earth seemed to launch my spaceship into hyperflight. I was gaining altitude and power and getting farther from the ground, and as I was increasing speed from a westerly wind, I knew this airborne outhouse was headed straight for town. There was nothing I could do, so I thought I might as well sit back and enjoy the flight. I learned that I could somewhat steer this half-moon missile by simply leaning left or right. I was flying over newly planted fields of corn and soybeans and acres of winter wheat. and soon I was flying in formation with a honking flock of returning Canadian geese. I was gaining confidence in my ability to control this unique flying machine, and I thought I should name it something bold but not too dapper. And thus, while orbiting the outskirts of my hometown, I proclaimed this to be the first flight of the cosmic Astro Crapper. Well, I ordered a town square 3 times, but then suddenly the prevailing winds had changed direction. I found myself rocketing back towards the family farm, hellbent for election. I seemed to be gaining altitude, and then suddenly my ship began descending fast, and then it occurred to this outhouse astronaut that his rocket had simply run out of gas. I was plummeting toward the earth. I did everything that I could. Somehow, some way, I managed to level out just as I entered Baker's Woods. Now, my cousin Harold was a hunter, and in Baker's Woods, he had built himself a truly deluxe deer stand. And although it was out of season, he often went there in the evenings just to enjoy the solitude of the land. Well, cousin Harold had just made himself comfortable and was opening a chocolate candy wrapper when into his view came you-know-who, that outhouse astronaut aboard his cosmic Astro Crapper. I crashed into the east side of that deer stand, and cousin Harold cannonballed out the west. Both of us had survived the crash, and thus in a dogwood tree 20 feet above the ground, the cosmic Astro Crapper had finally come to rest. Cousin Harold and I walked back to the family farm, and as we approached, we saw all kinds of flashing lights. Apparently, my family had called all sorts of emergency services as they witnessed the family outhouse leave the farm in flight. The fire department, the state police, the local paper, and people from the FAA all gathered around us at the launch site to listen to what we had to say. I told this fantastic ode in detail, and as the photographers raced out to their cars, Granddad looked at me with a twinkle in his eye and said, "Sonny, you owe me 10 cigars." Well, that adventure occurred years ago, and I'll not soon forget the lesson that I was taught. And I'm thankful for the direction it guided my career choices, where I am now NASA's one and only in-house outhouse astronaut. I wrote this story, this poem rather. Some friends and I kind of got into a competition writing poems about outhouses, and this was the second one I wrote, and it's an ongoing competition, and I've written a few more since. But I think the American outhouse is truly a true piece of Americana. That pretty much concludes the stories I had for tonight. But I wanted to mention a couple other local artists. I encourage people to check them out, and all the local artists around the area. That includes writers, painters, all kinds of artists, musicians. There's a lot of local talent out there, and a lot of these people are never recognized because they simply don't get the exposure that they so well deserve. And I've gotten to know a few of these people, and well, just to mention a couple offhand, one is George Raleigh Adams. I met Raleigh a little over a year ago, I believe now, and purchased I believe it's his first novel called South of Little Rock. And I read this story in 2 nights. It's a fantastic story, a fantastic read. You owe yourself to read this book. And then recently, Raleigh finished his second novel, which I now have, called Found in Pieces. And it is riveting. I've got about 10 pages left. I just started reading it the night before last. And it's a fantastic story. You got to read it to appreciate it. Great job, Raleigh. I knew it would be a good story, but it far surpassed all my expectations. So George Raleigh Adams from Pittsburgh, New York, fantastic reads. Another author that I've met recently, I've actually personally haven't met him, but we've communicated through emails and letters and whatnot. And his name is Rick Eichel. I actually read a book by him called House with a Heart, and it was a fantastic read also. It's such a personable story, and I don't want to give it away, but it's almost like he's in the living room telling it to you. It's really hard to describe. It is a fantastic read called House with a Heart. And through Rick, I also met his mother, who has passed away many years ago, I believe in 1988, who was a poet, Helen Corrigan Eichel. And Raleigh has written a book about her life called Candles of My Life. And it's about his mother and the poems she wrote. And it's a fantastic read also. And also, Rick has sent me a book called Lifelines, which is a selection of poetry written by Helen Corrigan Eichel. And I want to take just a couple moments to read a couple short poems. I've read all these poems. They are fantastic. I like poetry, and in my mind, she's one of the greatest poetries. She is the greatest poet I've read, I think. So I had a couple of short ones in here I wanted to read just to kind of give you a taste of it. These are some of my favorites. And this was a poem that she wrote to a blind friend. I'm sick of these four walls, I said, and then I thought of one who sits in darkness all day long, who never sees the sun, streaming through the window, flickering on the floor, who never sees a good friend coming through the door. My dear familiar rooms become mysteriously imbued with a new sheen of loveliness, of humble gratitude. I think that's such a fitting story for the times. I know things are tough right now, and we all are suffering in one way or another, but overall, I think we're pretty fortunate to be where we are today, and takes something like that, a poem like that, I think really brings that out. Another one I'd like to read to you very quickly is called A Walk with God. Again, these are by Helen Corrigan Eichel. These are not mine, these are hers, and they are fantastic. When in loneliness or sadness, how sweet it is for me to tarry with my Father in a secret reverie, to hear his dear voice speaking words of comfort, sweet and low, as he often spoke to others in the days so long ago. In his close embrace I wander midst his paths of joy and peace. With each successive step it seems both faith and love increase. And like misty clouds of morning vanish with the early ray, so do petty trials and worries in his presence fade away. Thus he calms my troubled spirit, leads me where the grass is green, shows me love and sweet communion that the world has never seen. And when once again I turn my mind to worldly thoughts and cares, I find that what seemed hard before is light indeed to bear. And there was one other one that I really like. This, I guess, this is my favorite one. Yep, as soon as I can find it here. Thought I had it marked. Well, I'm getting there. Thank you for your patience while I find my spot that I thought I had marked, but apparently I didn't. Here it is. This is entitled A Moment with You. I traveled back to yesterday through streets of laughter, through valleys of tears, meadows of sunshine and forests of fears, to find you, the child that I used to be. And I found you beneath our catapult tree, rocking your doll, but you couldn't see me. I said, little girl, I found you at last, in the unforgettable arms of the past. I have something to tell you I'd like to hide. I never grew up, though I tried and tried. And I want you to know that I have been true to the dreams we dreamed when I was you. I'd love to linger a while and play, but I have to hurry back to today. But remember, sometime we'll skip together down the beautiful sidewalks of forever. I love that poem. It has a fantastic balance to it and a rhythm that's hard to come by. So again, these are by Rick Eichel and George Raleigh Adams. Excuse me. There are many others out there, so check them out, your local authors and painters, musicians. I've come acquainted with a number of these people in the last few years, and it's amazing the talent that's close to home. So with that, I guess I'll say goodnight, and I hope you enjoyed this program. Once again, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and for Ryan Duffy and the Holland Land Office for inviting us. So good night, everyone. Have a good evening.
Well, I'd again like to thank everyone for coming out, and thank Eric for sharing some of his wonderful poems with us today. We'll be doing our best to get this uploaded to YouTube and other platforms for us. So you can always, if anybody did miss it, let them know, and we'll try to make sure that they can see it again. If you are interested in anything else, feel free to contact the museum. You can call us, send us an email. Email address is hollandlandoffice@gmail.com, and we can fill you in on any questions you might have. So I just want to let everyone have a good night. If you do have any questions, just let us know. But other than that, enjoy the rest of this rainy evening.